Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Halftime Talk, a weekly opportunity to take a slightly deeper dive into some of the big trends impacting the global energy markets and the global economy. And of course, on this occasion, that deep dive is into the Middle East geopolitical equation. What is the update and the outlook, and where is it going to go from here? And we're delighted. There is no better voice in the business to give us insights on that deep dive than Raghida Dergham, founder and executive chairman of the Beirut Institute, world famous analyst and world's greatest journalist for decades. Raghida, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for this introduction. Very generous of you. Thank you.
Well, sadly, in some ways, it's very opportune to have you on the halftime talk this week, given the backdrop of recent hours in the neighborhood. But let's just kick off slightly bigger picture, if we could, and go back a few days even before the return of the bombs. Last Friday, we had Russia, China, and Iran meeting to come to some common position regarding their posture vis-a-vis Iran in the region. And I wanted to get your insights on where is Russia-China position in the Middle East? We obviously are very familiar with the US position, very strongly allied with Israel and all of the associated positions it takes, whether Biden or Trump now. But where is Russia and China in this moment and their apparent alignment with Iran? Welcome your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I wouldn't make a big thing out of it. I think the maneuvers that took place between amongst the three countries are part of the arrangement that Iran has with China and Iran has with Russia. But neither Russia nor China is ready to jump in if Iran is in trouble with the United States. As you know, Russia is quite busy with its own preoccupations, namely not only Ukraine, but also how to resurrect or to rescue the relationship between the United States and Russia. And China is always, as China is, very engaged in its mindset, which is the economic path, and certainly is not going to come in and help Iran if Iran is going to say, I'm not cooperating on the nuclear, let's say. What we are witnessing right now is an increase of pressure by the Trump administration on Iran via the Houthis in Yemen, as we have been watching. I think it's quite clear that the administration is very serious about finishing the job in Yemen, meaning that the Houthi leaderships are not going to be intact after the operation is over. And no matter how long it takes, we've been told at any rate. But in the meantime, the message is to Iran that watch out, we're not going to let you get away with the nuclear and with the proxies. So we see what's happening in terms of the demands of the United States, of the Trump with President Trump himself and the Trump team, the demands of Iran.
Before we go too far into that Trump-Iran piece, but just coming back to Russia, because of course, Russia was a major player in Syria over the last decade until the recent overthrow of the Assad regime. And of course, Iran was its partner in Syria. Right. In the collapse of Russia and Iran's position in Syria, where are they now regionally, do you think? Obviously, they're no longer the kingmakers in Syria. Does that mean they are gone from the whole region?
Gone, they're not, but weakened, they are. Certainly, what happened to Iran in Syria is a big, to Iran first, and then I'll
Yeah,
speak about Russia if you don't mind. It's a big
please.
blow for Iran because, first of all, they had been suffering tremendously through the operations of Israel against Hezbollah, the very important arm of Iran in the region, the strong arm. That was already a huge setback because starting from the pagers, ending up in the operations of the Israelis in Lebanon. But then came Syria, and that was really a huge problem. I know that there was a disappointment by the Russians. They were very disappointed in Iran. They thought Iran can fulfill its promise that it can uphold the Bashar Assad regime. Whatever happens, well, overnight almost, what happened is that it collapsed. The regime is out and Iran is outed. But Iran is not
And on
satisfied
that
with
point,
that.
did Iran choose not to fight? I mean, it was a very strange collapse of the Syrian army and the defense. I mean, from that point of view, Russia and Iran both chose not to defend the regime.
Listen, I had heard something which I would have liked to double check before I would have repeated it, but I'm going to say it anyway right now, reserving myself the right to
Yes,
check
of
it later.
course. Uh,
I understood that it's actually Bashar al-Assad who had told Iran earlier on, pack up and get out. A little by little, not so obvious. So if that is true, that explains what happens, that they were in a weak position, but he did not do that knowing that he was going to be overthrown, that he was going to, lessen his dependence on Iran. But in the meantime, I mean, again, Iran was always feeling strong only by the Russian might, not only by the Iranian presence. So between that and the Russian weakness in Iran, Russian weakness in Syria,
Syria.
due to its preoccupation with Ukraine, Iran didn't see itself equipped to take on the whole thing. I think had they had the option, they would have fought it out. I think if Iran had had the option to fight it out and stay in Syria, they would have. I don't think it was a goodwill gesture by Iran. I think it was a runaway in order to preserve their own skin, if you will. Don't
Yeah.
forget, don't forget that at that point there was also, or is maybe, or was definitely then. Remember, the big player in Syria was Turkey. So remember that
In
that
the
Turkey.
revolution, in the overthrow of Assad.
Exactly. So Turkey was the kingmaker in Syria. Turkey was the godfather of the regime change in Syria. And Russia was, as we already agreed, preoccupied. Therefore, it was not going to confront Turkey and Syria. And Iran found itself, whoa, here we go. And then there are the Israelis. Israel was pounding Iranian positions inside Syria. So the
For
picture,
a
if
year or more. And one of the reasons why they had that face off, direct face off through the year last year. I think it's important to understand or get some sense for the audience that in that point that how weakened Iran is or isn't after the collapse in Syria, because I think that also gives some insight as to how strong they can stand in the face of direct engagement now with Trump's deployment against the Houthis in Yemen, and then coming face to face with his demands for the regime in Tehran. And that sort of what cards they've left in the deck, so to speak.
well, Iran has, from my sources who are familiar with Iranian thinking, they tell me that Iran is aware that the Europeans are not going to come to its rescue, particularly after its
I could have
stand,
told you that.
and
I don't
particularly
think you
after,
think Iranian thinking for that one. Yes, they're not
right?
even coming to their own rescue. Never mind Iran's.
Right, and then therefore they, Europeans are out as a potential supporter of the Iranian position in negotiations with the United States on the nuclear. Also, the Europeans are also like quite, quite aware of finally they finally recognize the big mistake they made during the presidency of Barack Obama when they accepted the Iranian condition that they would speak nuclear and only nuclear, but they would not speak about the behavior of Iran regionally. So then that price was paid by the region, and the Europeans finally said, "Oops, we shouldn't have done that." But it was too late, and they gathered a lot of dislike and disrespect for the European position on that matter. So there is no return to the 5+1 negotiations on the nuclear when the Europeans were helping Iran and accepting that Iran goes on with using its proxies to disrupt and to destabilize countries like Syria, like Lebanon, like Yemen, like Iraq. So that's out. Iran is also aware that it's on its own. Russia and China are not going to rescue or Iran at the expense of their national interest. What does Iran do then if, in fact, President Donald Trump goes ahead and um, and strikes nuclear facilities in Iran, or
I mean, the
allows
general
it?
narrative in Washington currently appears to be, and supported by the IAEA, that Iran is days, weeks, its capability ultimately to create a nuclear weapon is imminent. That's the reporting by the international agencies and adopted in Washington. That puts all of this in a fairly red light flashing
Exactly.
context.
And that explains, you're absolutely right. And that explains why the hurry, if you will, by the Trump administration to say, hey, listen, you accept the premise, which is in the letter that they sent, the demands of the Trump administration to Iran. You just you declare that you will not continue with your nuclear program, and then we negotiate. Iran says, no, we negotiate and then we decide how we're going to handle the nuclear program. But Iran, in the meantime, is thinking that should the Trump administration go ahead and lose its temper and goes into the mode of striking Iran directly, my sources tell me, those familiar with the thinking in Iran, that Iran plans to make Israel pay the price for Trump's adventure in Iran. What do I mean by that?
Where do you? Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, apparently, they in the thinking in Iran is that they would have to strike Israel big time, not through these operations they exchanged with each other in the past, a little bit of a missile here, a drone there. No, apparently they are planning to go all the way, serious missile strikes against Israel, possibly, according to that source, possibly a dirty bomb. And that's how, from their point of view, they could
So there's a
cost.
lot there's a lot at stake in that regard, if indeed they have the capability or not. Where does it? You say that there's not a Russia coming over the hill to stand with Iran. There's not a China coming over the hill. Europe is facing its own major challenge, not coming to any rescue program, not even diplomatically, perhaps. Where does that leave the Gulf Arab oil producers, particularly Saudi Arabia, which has had some form of rapprochement with Iran in the last 12, 18 months? And it doesn't have any great appetite to see the region, literally explode.
Yeah.
Does Saudi Arabia have a role to play here in tempering the Trump and Washington's posture, giving Iran some cover, some cards?
I do think the Saudis are in a position that permits them to influence the Trump administration in that context, the nuclear context. Remember, this is a different story. We're not talking about, compromise here and there. We're talking about, as you correctly pointed out, countdown to a nuclear acquisition by Iran, a nuclear weapon acquisition. So I don't think the Saudis will venture there. I mean, they would completely try to persuade the Trump administration to do its best to avoid and avert a strike that would lead to a major war, particularly that they are in the neighborhood. But on the other hand, if Iran is in fact engaging or will engage Israel militarily, then it really becomes an Iran-Israel issue much more than it is an Iran Gulf issue. Yes, of course, the Gulf countries will be put on the spot. Yes, of course, they prefer not to have any military confrontation of that kind, because, as you said, it's going to reflect, and it's going to leave its imprints and its effects, consequences on that region. But I don't think when it comes to the nuclear issue that they would be heavy. Yeah, they would be heavy in their weight one way or another, because that's way it's bigger than they would wish to handle.
When
That's
you
what I think.
consider all of those sorts of things, there's no moderating player here in this face-off between Washington and Tehran. Does Tehran concede? Does it genuflect? Is there a bridge that can be built between an aging Khamenei who is, they're very focused on the transition to the next, they're very much dealing with that internally in Iran. Where do
Yeah.
you think there's a bridge here to try and put some sort of moderating factor between these two principles, Washington, i.e., Trump, and Tehran and the supreme ruler?
We hear that there is a lot of division amongst the ranks of the Iranians, but as you pointed out, it really now still boils down to the supreme ruler, Ali Khamenei. Now, we know a lot. We've heard a lot about the Iranian pride. Always that the pride, I mean, we will not do this, we will not do that, we will not accept the demands, unilateral demands of the United States. We are Iran, etc. Yes, but I think at stake here, the real issue, from my point of view, is the doctrine of Iran, the raison d'etre of the regime in Tehran, which is to acquire a nuclear capability. I mean, remember, they were able to get from the Obama administration a recognition of sort of the right to nuclear, not to the nuclear weaponization, but they wanted that right. And the Obama administration said, we will not interfere with your regime. You could do whatever you want to do regionally. That was a great gift by the Obama administration to Iran. Well, they're not going to
That's
get
you're
that
saying
from.
essentially through the nuclear agreement that they did regarding giving access to the IAEA and so forth.
Exactly, exactly. But now the Iranians are being faced by the Trump demands, which is reform your doctrine, reform, and then you'll be rewarded. Reform meaning what? Make sure that under every, not only the IAEA supervision, but also other countries, including the United States, to make sure that they have access to supervise the program, that it will never be able to reach the militarization of the nuclear capabilities in Tehran. That is one of the demands that Iran is absolutely livid about. This is a Trump demand, by the way, which was put to them recently, and they are absolutely furious that how dare you discuss our pride, the nuclear pride. So one element of the doctrine is the nuclear. After all, they rally their people on that. They say, remember, we are Iranians, we are Farsis, we have the capability, etc., etc. Therefore, it is really an important element of the survival of the regime. The second part of the doctrine is, of course, the proxies, which is the problem, because it's about raising militias in other countries as I said, to destabilize them, and to use these militias for the expansion of Iran. Now, apparently, this is again not acceptable to the Trump administration, which is clear in what's happening to Hamas now, what happened to Hezbollah, and what happened in Syria. I'm not suggesting this is an American development in Syria, but it's welcome by both the Israelis and the Americans that Iran is kicked out of Syria, and now the Houthis. So the question is, will the regime in Tehran accept to reform its doctrine, or does it still think that both the proxies and the nuclear are the very raison d'etre of the existence of the regime, and without it, they will fall apart? I think they're not budging on the doctrine. If I were them, I would. I would feather the doctrine. I would reform a little bit and accept the offer of Donald Trump, which is come. We will resume good relations on bilateral level. We will lift sanctions. You will be rehabilitated in the world, etc. But I fear that the Iranian pride will win, and the doctrine will take a
Is
priority.
just to sort of clarify on that point, is the Iranian pride and the preservation of the regime in Iran the same thing? I mean, the Iranian pride, if you go down that path, you risk losing the regime. It strikes me they've always been, their North Star has been the preservation of the Islamic Republic regime.
Indeed, indeed. The reservation of the regime is over and above everything else. And from their point of view, this is the preservation of the interests of Iran. You and I will not agree because we have a different logic. I mean, why would you want to risk a huge war when you can, take a look, calculate what has happened in the last 40 years. Yes, you've become self-sufficient rather,
Sustainable.
sustainable on the internal level. But look where your people are compared to the people in the region. You would say logically put the evolution of Iran, the future evolution of Iran above the survival of the regime. But then for them, it's not. It's the doctrine. I mean, in fact, I don't think Donald Trump is telling them that I want the regime change. He's not suggesting that. To my knowledge, he's not. But they link the survival of the regime to both the nuclear ambition and the proxies. That's the problem. The logic would have it is that they would reform a little bit and stay in power, but they don't see it that way. It's a different logic in Iran, in the regime in
Let's
Tehran.
let's just wrap up with a very small question. I'm joking because obviously
Sorry
it's a very
about that.
big
Yeah.
one.
Sorry about
But
going all
that
the way.
I know that you are one of the leading international journalists that covered the United Nations for so many years, and with the Trump 2.0 revolution, I wanted to get your sense on the outlook for the UN as surviving as an institution of 80 years and playing so many critical roles in the world, feeding UNICEF, the World Food Program, amongst many other things, and also obviously the peacekeeping where it can. But can the UN be future-proofed against Donald Trump? What's your outlook for the United Nations?
I think the UN has deteriorated tremendously in the last few years, quite honestly. There may be certain agencies that still do a good job, but the bureaucracy outgrew the efficiency of the organization altogether. And I think there has been a very serious setback for the United Nations way before Donald Trump came and said, here's what you need to do, and here are the consequences. I think that the very system that was supposedly part of the UN in dealing with world crises had collapsed. I don't think the UN has been able to deal with any of the world crises. You could tell me because of the veto power competition. You could tell me because it's really the Security Council and member states. Yes, indeed. However, it's also the inefficiency and the huge bureaucracy and actually the low level of professionalism at the United Nations. And I am personally disappointed, not only in the Security Council, but also with the Secretariat, particularly that Mr. Guterres came in to take a place of a woman twice. We thought he was going to shock us with something fabulous. I'm not so sure he's done the fabulous for the UN. He hasn't done a bad job. I respect him, but the fabulous is not there.
Yeah, we might need some fabulous to see it surviving as a child of a UN staffer and the peacekeeping missions of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. It has always tried to do, at least those working on the ground have always tried
Yeah,
to do their best. We could
indeed.
talk for hours, Raghida Dergham. We could talk for hours, but unfortunately, we don't have that. We have a beautiful, wonderful half hour together. So thank you so much, Raghida Dergham,
Thank
founder and
you.
executive chairman of the Beirut Institute. Needs no introduction and all her incredible achievements and biography, most notably for my generation of international journalists our North Star for what was the standard. So we thank you for that, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you.